The consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. The public is invited to attend the meeting virtually by using the Zoom meeting information on the city website. I call to order the study session of February 28th, 2022. I see all council members are here except for Councilmember Newman, and she did call in today. So can I have a motion to excuse Charla Newman?
Mayor, I move we excuse Councilmember Newman from attending this evening.
I second it.
Thank you. Motion by Reed and seconded by Potato. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Passes unanimous. And we will move on to regular business. I will hand this over to City Administrator Jason Wilson.
Thank you, Mayor. Tonight we have a consultant with us named Paul Dunn. I'm going to turn it over to IT Manager Brian Cunningham, who will introduce the topic, and Mr. Dunn.
Good evening, Mayor and council members.
Good evening.
For a number of years now, we've been trying to figure out what the best way to deal with fiber internet is. So we decided we should see about embarking on a fiber study to determine things like, where are we at now? Where do we need to be in the future? What will our current service, will our current services provide the speeds we may need in the future? And will it be advantageous to continue to pay an ISP? Or will it be more cost effective to run our own lines? Also, for the network and cybersecurity, how is that going to work in the future? And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to find somebody who was well-versed in understanding this technology and who's done work before. So I'd like to introduce Paul Dunn from Dunco. He's got an extensive background in fiber consulting, including the Community Connectivity Consortium. Boy, that's a tongue twister.
Okay, Mr. Dunn.
Okay, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Mayor and council members. Pleased to be with you this evening. Per Brian's intro, I am Paul Dunn. I'm the principal of Dunco Diversified Services. I've got 22 years of work with educational, municipal, and agency IT departments and projects. So seen a little bit of fiber. Tonight I have a PowerPoint presentation for you, and I'm going to go through about 4 main topics. There'll be a technology overview just to get you acquainted with what fiber optic is, how it's built out, and some of the advantages and drawbacks of some of the different construction techniques. We'll talk about profiles of our neighboring cities and school districts, their fiber optic usage, their plans, and how those fiber systems integrate into their operations. We'll dive down deeper into the Sumner Fiber Optics network planning and construction cost estimates. And that was really the focus of the study, was to explore construction techniques, costs, and potential routes for a fiber optic network in the city of Sumner. And then we'll look at recommendations and conclusions. And I'll pause for questions following each topic, just so that we don't get too far down the road with any unanswered questions. Some of this gets a little technical, and I've done my best to not deliver death by PowerPoint and a highly technical presentation. Well, fiber optics is an asset, and typically fiber optic systems have a lifespan of 20 to 25 years. A good example of that is the Tacoma Fire Department in 1996 implemented a fiber optic communications network, a ring around the city of Tacoma that connects all of their fire stations. It's still in active use today. Traffic control systems rely on fiber optic more and more for centralized control of traffic signals throughout areas. They can be used to monitor and adjust traffic flows, not just at an intersection, but throughout a city. If you take automatic vehicle location, which is an acronym, AVL, and I'll try not to do too much alphabet soup also. You can link automatic vehicle location with public safety vehicles, and you link that with ITS. Those two systems can clear a path for emergency vehicles. Today, they have what's called Opticon, which is a flashing light on top of a police car or a fire vehicle towards an intersection. Well, that clears up one intersection and turns the lights green. With automatic vehicle location, intelligent traffic systems can be used to clear the full path so that you're looking more than one traffic light ahead for a fire
Paul?
truck to get to its site. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're not seeing your PowerPoint deck.
I am very sorry.
You're doing a great job of describing them, though.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep.
Please forgive me. Okay, can we see it now? Okay, good. Thank you. So SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition systems, are used primarily in public works applications. Right now, Sumner has a combination of radio and T1, which are slow speed data lines to connect your city wells, pump stations, and so forth. With fiber connections, you could improve physical security and reliability of those connections. CCTV cameras can be mounted at or on signal locations and can share the ITS connections to provide real-time visual information of the traffic situation within your city. You can also use a fiber network that centralizes all of your facilities to handle building management and security systems, and they'll benefit from central management and control. We'll talk a little bit about fiber optic technology and how it compares to the technologies that we've grown familiar with, starting with dial-up. If you still have a dial-up connection today, you can get 56 kilobits of data per second, which amounts to not much. If you imagine a 5 gigabyte movie at current data speeds that the city of Sumner operates at, which is approximately 150 megabits per second, it would take about 9 minutes to just download that data. At fiber optic, it would take about 5 seconds. So again, if you look at the capacity for a fiber optic network compared to Sumner's existing capacity, it's akin to trying to drink Lake Washington through a drinking straw. I'll talk about fiber optic network construction methods, and there are 4 predominant ones. The first is standard plowing or trenching, and this involves a cut in the pavement or potentially alongside a road right of way, anywhere from 2 to 3 feet wide and down to about 4 to 5 feet deep. Inside that trench, you can install what are known as 4 interducts, and 1 interduct, or 4 conduits. 1 conduit can hold usually about 3 interducts. Think of those as miniature conduits that carry fiber optic cable. This is the highest cost and probably most intrusive construction method for implementing fiber optic. It can be as high as $300 a foot in high density or medium density urban areas. When we did our construction estimates for the city of Sumner, we're estimating Sumner anywhere from $89 a foot to $113 a foot for construction. It's based on the location of the actual construction, whether it's in a right of way, in a street, maybe on a trail. The national average is $173 a foot. So to sum up there, it's the most disruptive and expensive construction method, especially if you're working in streets. A new technology that really started about 15 years ago is a concept called microtrench. And what it amounts to is, instead of digging that wide trench in a street, you're looking at a slit of 1 to 3 inches wide and 18 to 24 inches deep. In the bottom of that small slit is installed micro conduit. And through that micro conduit, the fiber optic is usually blown through using pressurized air. And it's really becoming a dominant construction technique in fiber optic network construction these days. New York and Los Angeles have both adopted ordinances to support microtrenching. There are some areas in the city of New York that will not allow any other trenching method for fiber optic network installation. In Sumner, we estimated that microtrenching can range from $24 a foot in trail to $72 a foot in your right-of-way. And there's a couple pictures here showing the actual grinding of a slit and then installation of micro conduit in that slit. Some folks have been able to see up to half a mile per day of micro trench installation. So not only is it less impactful, but it is much faster than standard plow and trench. Then there's aerial, and I think this is probably the one that we might find ourselves most familiar with because it's not underground. You see it on the poles around town. And it's funny, as I was doing this study, I began spending a lot of time looking up at what was hanging off the telephone poles. I never did until I got down in the details of the study. Aerial is the lowest cost construction method. It runs approximately $10 a foot. However, it's the most vulnerable construction method. It's vulnerable to vehicle accidents, tree trimming, weather, other natural disasters, and you also wind up with annual pole use fees. So if you're putting fiber optic cable onto a pole owned by Puget Sound Energy, right now the rates are about $17 a pole per year. So you have an annual cost that accrues as you're doing aerial construction. Again, balance it with lower cost, and it's a viable alternative. The last predominant construction method is what's called horizontal directional boring. And this is a photo of a boring machine. Most recently, City of Auburn did a project down Lake Tapps Parkway from Lakeland Hills all the way down to East Valley Highway. And they used horizontal boring for the distance of that project. So it's a viable installation method. It does limit the number of conduits that you can place underground because one bore equals one conduit. It basically bores the conduit path and installs the conduit and interduct at the same time. It is less intrusive, and it's traditionally used in areas where you need to get under a street or an intersection because you can simply bore from one side to the other. Depending on the total length of the project, the number of bores that are needed, costs are pretty variable. We estimated $29 a foot for short runs contracted as a group within the project. And within the project, I believe there were about 15 spots where boring would be needed just to allow installation of conduit underneath intersections or streets. So at this point, before I launch into a profile of Sumner's IT network, are there any questions or clarifications that I can give for you?
Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor. Paul, I got a question on the aerials, and is there a conflict with the new 5G packs that are going to be on many of the poles? Are there any signal interruptions or conflicts?
First off, thank you, Council Member. We wouldn't see any signal interruptions because the 5G is going to be radio. Secondly, in most installations, the engineering drawings that I've seen for radio or wireless installations versus fiber optics and communications is that there's standards that place the communications cables down below the power, and radio and other equipment generally is above the power or above the telecommunications cables that are in place.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Mayor Hochstetter.
Yes, Paul, are you suggesting that we use a combo of these methods on where they work best, or do we select one?
Our suggestions and recommendations in the report are to use a combination where feasible. There are examples where using microtrenching along the trail right-of-ways is a good option. There are other examples where aerial will offer a lower cost option. It depends on location and the feasibility of a traditional trench, microtrench, aerial, or horizontal boring. So it's not one size fits all.
Thank you.
Councilmember Brown.
Yes, above ground. What are we paying for in that $10?
I'm sorry, council member, I didn't understand your question.
We're paying $10 a foot if you go above the ground. What are you paying for?
I understand now, thank you. In aerial construction, the construction cost estimates of $10 a foot include labor, hardware, and what are called snowshoes in some cases. So there's additional hardware that's used in an aerial installation. It is significantly lower because you're not having to dig underground. So it would be mounting hardware, in some cases what's called messenger wire, which actually holds the fiber optic in the air. So it is a lower cost.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Dunn? I already have 17 wires on my telephone pole blocking my mountain view, so maybe one more wouldn't be seen, but I don't know.
That is one consideration. There are some areas where those poles are getting pretty full.
Yeah. I think that's all the questions we had right
Okay,
there.
right, thank you. So Sumner's IT network today uses a buffet of different connection techniques. We have Comcast using Comcast Business that serves several of the locations. We have services from Lumen, also formerly known as CenturyLink, and we actually have some cellular hotspots coming via T-Mobile. So each of these has distinct bandwidths. The highest bandwidth is at City Hall, and this represents your internet connection from the City of Sumner network out to the internet. Location to location coverage is at 100 megabits per second. City shop, and then we go down to 40 megabits per second at the cemetery and the cemetery shops. So right now it's a mix of commercial carriers to provide your data networking for IT between all city facilities. And the limitations of bandwidth really come into play when you have a lower bandwidth connection. For example, voice communications to the cemetery is difficult, if not impossible. Bandwidth out to your senior center is fairly slow. It would limit public use. And you have a need for CCTV connections like the Daffodil Valley Sports Complex that just can't be met today. Now, I will say Sumner has done a really good job in building out conduit capacity in recent projects. And for example, the Traffic Avenue, Cannery Way Bridge, the East Main Street and the Puyallup Bridge, all incorporated conduit into those construction projects. And I'm I'm thankful, and I know Sumner's thankful that you did, because implementing conduit in bridge construction is probably the highest cost construction out there. So Sumner IT department goals today are to establish resilient, sustainable connections out to the internet, to provision high-speed connectivity between the city facilities. So to build your city a full high-speed network between all city locations. You want to reduce your data connectivity costs, and this gets into the own it versus lease it discussion. And also to partner with adjacent agencies and cities to establish connectivity. A good example would be connectivity between the city of Sumner and South Sound 911, allowing public safety communications a direct, secure fiber link between the city and South Sound 911 dispatch capabilities. Sumner owned fiber network would reduce or eliminate your annual spend. Right now, you spend about $24,000 a year on data communications costs. Having your own network would drop those costs to zero. So as part of the study, we had discussions and conversations with Bonnie Lake, Puyallup, the City of Auburn, the Sumner Bonnie Lake School District, and the Puyallup School District, as well as the Community Connectivity Consortium. And in this presentation, I'll go into some details on each of your neighbors and neighbor agencies. So Bonnie Lake operates their own fiber network. It serves all their city facilities. And they have done a great deal of their work with a communications company named Zayo. I'll be talking about Zayo a couple more times during our presentation. And they've entered into sharing and partnership in some areas, and those have really mutually benefited them. Their long-term goals, just like Sumner's, are to increase their network resiliency or redundancy. They plan on using more and more cloud-based resources. For example, they're considering moving their ERP, employee resource package, so that's human resources and finance, into the cloud. I'll also say that the Sumner Grade fire in September 2020 caused a 3-day outage to the city's internet connections, and that really focused Bonnie Lake on the need to establish some redundant connections to get out to the internet. To address that need, at least short term, they implemented a microwave radio link to provide backup internet connectivity for the city. Bonnie Lake and Zayo cooperate very closely. Zayo recently was unable to negotiate with the Washington State DOT to install some of their fiber optic lines under State Route 410. Bonnie Lake had existing conduit capacity, and they partnered with Zayo to allow Zayo to use existing conduit that was already crossing under Highway 410. So a good example of public and private partnership. The City of Puyallup's IT department manages not just IT and not just the IT network, but they also manage the city's fiber optic and traffic signal communications infrastructure. They have 62 signalized intersections. Right now, about half of those are connected via fiber. The remaining signals connect wirelessly. So what they've been able to achieve is full control of all of their signalized intersections. Right now, their overall communications budget is about $67,000. That comprises not just some leasing of fiber optics, but also their phone bill, cellular phones, and some data communication costs to the internet. Puyallup is contracted with Zayo and UPN, which stands for United Private Networks, for dark fiber connectivity, where city-owned infrastructure or fiber isn't present. So what dark fiber is basically fiber optics that are not controlled by the vendor. It's owned or leased directly by the City of Puyallup, and there's no third-party interaction to provide service over that fiber. They have partnered with Zayo and UPN, as well as the Puyallup School District, to share resources amongst themselves, and it has reduced their overall data communications budget. Auburn has grown their fiber optic network. Really, they really got busy in the early 2000s. They have 36 miles of fiber optic network. It serves data communications, traffic signal management, and public works facilities management. They've made it a strong priority in reviewing any new projects that come along to see whether fiber optic service is needed or would be beneficial. They place $300,000 a year annually in the capital fund reserve for fiber optic maintenance and new projects. So they have a little bit of a layaway plan or a savings account, if you will, for fiber optic. When they plan new projects, they have a workflow that puts the project before all city departments, and they have a chance to have a place at the table in planning, particularly for IT, to make sure that if they're going to dig, they dig once and incorporate conduit or fiber optic for their needs. They also lease a little bit of their fiber optic and infrastructure conduit to telecommunications companies. And we'll talk a little bit more about public-private work and leasing of resources when we discuss funding opportunities. Auburn is one of the founding members of the Community Connectivity Consortium, also known as C3. They contribute about just under 6 miles of fiber optic to the C3 regional network. I will go into some detail about the C3 network as we move forward here.
Paul, what kind of maintenance does it take? You said fiber optic maintenance. What kind of, is it ongoing maintenance?
There's not a lot of ongoing maintenance. Generally, maintenance gets into areas where you might have a fiber cut or an interruption. Say if there's a backhoe working on another project and it interrupts fiber optic service. Okay. In some cases, you may need to do some splicing of fiber optic strands to serve other locations. So it's actually fairly low maintenance, but you do want to have some money in reserve for particularly emergency maintenance, because fiber optic cuts never happen at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning.
Thank you.
Yes. So the Sumner Bonnie Lake School District, within Sumner, the school district has 4 schools and 2 program locations. They also have the administrative offices housed in Sumner. In 2016, they completed a build out of a leased fiber optic network with WAVE, also known as Astound Broadband. All of their schools are connected via a high-speed fiber optic network. The initial cost of that network was $1.32 million. In 2021, their communication budget was $157,315 for data services. And that represents leasing services from WAVE to serve their network. The good news for school districts and libraries is the federal government's E-rate program. They recapture about 50% of their communication spend. They really saw the need as the 2010s advanced to get high-speed data services to all of their schools. As we all know, technology in schools has blossomed since the early 2000s, and the requirement for high-speed connectivity just keeps increasing. You know, with every student has a laptop, think of the bandwidth that's needed in those environments. So they've done a pretty good job in building out their network. I will say that there's quite a bit of detail for each of these cities and partners in the printed report that you have that shows maps of the various cities and districts, fiber networks. The Puyallup School District has 34 schools, 6 support facilities. They lease a great deal of their wide area network or fiber network from UPN, United Private Networks. They've been in operation with their fiber network for about 12 years, and they get about 50% of their data communications budget reimbursed through E-rate. But all of their schools are connected via fiber optic and out to the internet. We'll talk about the Community Connectivity Consortium. So this is a pretty unique organization that has grown organically to what it is today. They started out in the early 2000s with a partnership between the city of Kirkland and the Lake Washington School District to share conduit space and fiber optic resources. Then the UW got involved because the UW happened to have about 10 miles of fiber optic cable sitting in a warehouse. And they got together and began connecting things. And they operate on what's known as a project agreement foundation. So each of the members can engage in project agreements to share resources between one another. And in 2017, rather, the C3 went live with a full 100 gigabit capacity ring around Lake Washington. It's served by the 6 node sites that you see on the map. And what this allows a member city to do is connect to the ring via fiber optic at a node site, which will then give you high-speed, secure data traffic to the Weston Data Center in Seattle or the Saby Data Center in Tukwila. These are 2 of the major internet points of presence in the Pacific Northwest. What this allows is direct connections. For example, the city of Bellevue, city of Redmond, and the city of Kirkland now have direct connections to Microsoft Azure. So they have a dedicated high-speed link to their cloud resources for Office 365, Teams phones. The Bellevue city uses Teams telephone service, all provided over the ring with connections to Microsoft directly at the Weston Data Center. The ring's been operational now. It's highly reliable. It's been operational since 2017. C3 is planning expansion to Pierce County and Tacoma. They have a planned node site at South Sound 911. South Sound 911 has joined the consortium because they see a benefit in connecting the public safety access points at Valleycom and Norcom in Kent and Bellevue. C3 members also get significant data transport savings over commercial providers. For example, if you need 10 gigabit service using the C3 services, it costs about $4,000 a year. If you were to contract for that commercially, you'd be paying anywhere from $21,000 to $50,000 a year for 10 gigabit service. The consortium also has fiber optic reserves to allow members direct connection between their sites and also between C3 node sites. Good example of that is Valley Medical Center just recently implemented a direct connection from Valley Medical Center in Renton up to the King County node in Renton Highlands. Now Valley doesn't have their own fiber network that extends that far, but there are C3 cables in the area where strands of cable are held in trust for C3 members to put into use. So it benefits all of the members. It's a very strong organization. They've installed over 265 miles of fiber optics infrastructure throughout their cities and throughout King County. So we would consider that a neighbor agency or a neighbor to Sumner. Your closest link or hookup, if you will, to the consortium right now would be joining via Auburn at East Valley Highway and Lake Tapps Parkway, right at the north end of Sumner. Sumner currently has franchise agreements with 6 telecommunications companies. Most of those agreements are to allow the companies to operate and manage long-haul data lines through the city. Zayo and Wave currently have infrastructure in Sumner to serve data communications customers. We mentioned Sumner Bonnie Lake School District as a Wave customer. Zayo is a Bonnie Lake provider and also has some private services within the city. Comcast has exclusive or a non-exclusive cable TV provider for internet services and cable TV to all points in Sumner. And I'll stop here for questions. We're at 6:35. I understand that we'll need to wrap up by 7, so I'll go as quickly as I can. Mayor, I think you're muted.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Dunn? Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you. I just had a question about that last bullet point. Does this allow, or would it ever in the future allow us to have our own, the ability of the city to allow citizens to get cheaper cable and internet service?
Thank you, council member. I would say that the plan as we have it now did not incorporate services, internet services to the citizens of Sumner. However, as a couple of the case studies indicate in the document I've prepared, and I will discuss a little bit later, there are certainly economic opportunities to provide TV and internet services via internet to the citizens of Sumner. And one of the case studies shows a pretty good financial model for that. It was a city in Maryland, approximately the same size as Sumner, that incorporated that. And I will address that a little bit further when we talk about public-private partnerships.
Thank you.
Councilmember Botetto.
Yeah, earlier when you talked about the different companies that Sumner uses for our internet, would it make sense to have one company, or is this probably the best, I don't know, use, or do they give us the best price for, each company?
Thank you. I think that's a good question. And I think the best way to answer it is to look at how the network for Sumner was built. And this is the existing network using commercial providers. The evaluation of the need and the availability of service was a consideration as those things were built out. Also costs. In some cases, contracts go from 3 to 5 years, say with Lumen, and you don't have the opportunity to jump over to a lower cost connection with Comcast until one contract is expired. So it's a sedimentary growth of services. They all came at different times.
Oh, okay. All right, that makes sense. Thanks.
Councilmember Cole.
Oops, sorry. Yeah. So my question is, I'm curious as to how many miles of this of fiber optic would be needed. I know that there are different construction methods for doing that, and you said that you would use a combination of them. So does Sumner already have some in place, or would it be just brand new all around?
The plan that we arrived at, and I will get to it in a couple slides, shows that we'd be implementing just over 9 miles of fiber optic, and it would be a combination of construction techniques.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No other questions. Continue on.
Okay, thank you. So in 2019, Sumner IT Department and Public Works Department put together what they felt was a high-level plan implementing a possible fiber optic network. They put this into 2 phases. The first was to connect most city facilities, and the second part of the phase was to connect traffic signals and the wastewater treatment plan. Now, when we began working with Sumner and examining plans, we did some refinements. We based it on the following assumptions: that trail right-of-way is less intrusive and less expensive than using streets. We know that micro-trenching either on trail or street right-of-way will lower costs significantly. Aerial is the least expensive, and it really seems to be a priority within Sumner to get all of your traffic signals connected for central management. So Councilmember Cole, to answer your question, the network as we designed it is about 9.1 miles total, and it's broken into 3 phases. The first phase is 3.3 miles, the second phase is 3.3 miles, and the third phase is 2.5 miles. 2 miles are on trail right-of-way, and 5 miles of aerial path are available. In the first phase, we install what we called the north-south backbone. We installed the core of that backbone, and we connect priority city facilities. Phase 2 builds out the north-south backbone and connects more city facilities. Phase 3 is designed to be a la carte. You can actually take individual projects as required that basically connect to the already established network. So I do want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions. I will say in the report, these projects are detailed out, heavy detail with construction cost estimates and so forth. So we'll say that phase 1 is primarily aerial. If you look at the long stretches of blue on existing poles, the orange is underground trenching or micro trenching. And we estimated phase 1 to connect the future city shops, the city hall, the wastewater treatment plant, and some of the signals along 142nd, as well as on Main Street. The initial cost for phase 1 is about $505,000. In phase 2, we connect remaining city facilities. So this adds the cemetery, the shops and office at the cemetery, the Ryan House, the senior center, the sports complex. It also completes the east-west fiber link to move across from City Hall to the sports complex and a portion of the Valley Avenue north-south backbone. And it connects traffic signals along those routes as well. Most significantly, the Cannery Way Bridge and onto Valley Avenue heading west. Phase 2 uses primarily microtrench, aerial construction where it's feasible, and the construction cost estimate is about $860,000. Phase 3 of the project establishes connectivity to all signals within the city that are city owned or managed. And the segments there can be individually built. A north-south backbone extension from the future city shops location up to interconnection with Auburn. Up this route is one of the projects. The Auburn Interconnect, which is a short link from right here at the bottom of the bridge, under Burlington Northern and joining at East Valley Highway to the City of Auburn's network. The Puyallup Interconnect, which goes from the wastewater treatment plant across the Puyallup River Bridge and west on Main Street to join Puyallup at Shaw Road. The Sumner Schools Loop is a loop within the city that connects administrative headquarters for the Sumner Bonnie Lake School District, and so allows some redundancy in fiber optic networking also in the city. So you could have a broken portion here and service could still be provided via redundant links. It also includes the Sumner Avenue, or Valley Avenue rather, north-south backbone extension, which goes south to Gary Street and would allow signal control as far south. The Stewart Avenue West Spur takes us right to the edge of the existing White River Improvement Project. So there's an opportunity to connect to fiber optics that may be available on the other side of the river.
Councilmember Potato, did you have something for?
Yeah,
Now?
in phase 1, when I'm looking at the map, there are a bunch of blue symbols.
Yes,
know, are those relay station or what are those?
those are existing traffic signals.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that's a very high level review of the 3 phases of the project. And I'll stop here for questions and happy to clarify anything.
Any other questions for Mr. Dunn? I see none.
Okay, thank you, Mayor.
Oh, wait.
Actually,
Mr. Reed.
I have a couple. First of all, I know it's definitely important for the tech side of healthy businesses. And I recognize that this is primarily focused on providing internal city services to our shops and other locations, which makes total sense. But I have a couple of questions about, one is, what is our ask? Other than, is this just an update of the study? And then a couple of other things that are missing that I would prefer to see included, or maybe could be followed up later, would be like a 20-year cost to build and maintain versus a 20-year cost to lease or contract with an established ISP. And you already answered my other question about 5G. And then I don't know the partnerships and the competition, but I also wondered how PSE could be a part of this. As my understanding, they're converting a lot of their lines to underground fiber, and I didn't know if that's something that's also a partnership opportunity to not only run the fiber, but also the power in the same manner. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And I'll work backwards if I can from your last question. In cases where Puget Sound Energy is undergrounding, whether they do it on their own initiative or on their, if they're required, say, for a project in a neighborhood improvement, we would recommend that the city consider dig once policies so that conduit for the city is implemented at the same time the trenches are open to install conduit for underground utilities. And I would note, I'll note it here, but also later in the presentation, the city of Bellevue does just that. Anytime someone comes to Bellevue and says, we need to dig, we need to excavate, the city requires review of those plans and retains the option to install city-owned conduit in those locations. So this goes a long ways to what I call the dig once, what everybody calls the dig once philosophy. If you've got a trench open, that's your best time and lowest cost is to add at that time. Regarding build versus buy, over time, and we do talk about it a little bit further in the presentation, it's about a break even on a 25-year plan just for a city network. Now, I do talk about the case studies we've done, and I will talk a little bit about public-private partnerships and other opportunities. It's not covered in the scope of this report, but I do think it's worthwhile to evaluate and discuss with partners possible extensions of service for your citizens for internet service. There are revenue opportunities there.
Thank you, and I appreciate that, and I am definitely interested in hearing, for speaking for myself, I'm definitely interested in hearing about how we can establish it and recruit ISPs to provide services to the public, but I have zero interest in becoming a provider.
I understand that, and I think your sentiment is echoed by many other cities who look at these opportunities. In the case study that I did provide here, the city of Westminster, Maryland, actually had a very good arrangement. They wound up owning the network and leasing the network to an internet service provider. So they got the best of both worlds, and they're seeing revenue on an annual basis. Okay, any other questions?
No, no other questions.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move into the fun part of the presentation, and this is recommendations. We have three categories of recommendations for you. One relates to standards and practices for development and construction. So this is basically a how-to manual, if you will, and it allows the foundation for further planning. We'll talk a little bit about funding strategies, what we know is there, what's available, and we'll talk about collaboration and public-private partnerships. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a deeper dive into Q&A when we're all done. So under standards and practices, we're advising that a fiber optic master plan for the city is developed. And that differs from this presentation in that what we did here was a pro forma construction cost and plan estimate. A fiber optic master plan is going to allow Sumner to align your overall long-term strategic objectives with fiber optic network strategies. You can address the questions of how the network will benefit the city and identify a path towards completion. Ideally, that plan is going to address the first 5 years in a great amount of detail and less detailed but strategic goals for the next 10 to 20 years. Micro-trenching construction is going to save significant costs. The city should consider adopting standards for micro-trenching and their placement. And that is to say, where is it appropriate, where it is not appropriate. We recommend that the city establish a workflow for permitting that allows city departments to review and comment on the plans. Can help identify opportunities for addition of city conduit or infrastructure as part of the project. Review of project permits, as I mentioned earlier, Bellevue requires a review and asks for conduit placement where they see it advantageous. Any new sidewalk projects in Bellevue require installation of conduit underneath the sidewalks. You should identify priority locations where Sumner can benefit from utilizing a dig once policy. And you should review your franchise agreements on a periodic basis, not just to include dig once terms as part of those agreements, but just on a regular basis to make sure that the terms are favorable and in alignment with the fiber optic master plans. In the area of funding strategies, there's a few areas, and first would be the city budget. As we mentioned earlier, Auburn has established a long-term reserve for fiber optic projects. So they've been able to put a lot of their fiber optic network on layaway, if you will. They have some money set aside for it. In discussions with IT and Public Works and also with City Administrator Wilson, the consideration of rate models, including the network costs for the wastewater treatment plant portion of the network, might allow some revenue if rates were adjusted to help finance the projects. There's quite a bit of detail in the report itself that talks about fiber optic leasing. Favorable terms to the city could realize revenues of anywhere from $750 to $1,500 per strand mile. And if we use the north-south backbone as an example, that's sort of a fiber optic interstate highway through Sumner. The city could realize anywhere from $5,500 to $93,000 annually in a lease, indefeasible rights of usage, leasing 24 strands of fiber to a carrier. Now, the first question that probably pops to mind is, well, why is that such a big price range? And the reason is that each of these lease agreements are built between a city and internet traffic company, and they vary all the way from Eugene, Oregon, where I looked at the $5,500 a mile, to the San Francisco Bay Area that is getting $93,000. So there's a wide range. There are some supplemental documents to the report that discuss fiber leasing in some detail. It could be advantageous to the city to examine fiber leasing to a carrier. And you have two carriers that you have great relationships with already in your city. That's Zayo and Wave. They are both franchisees. They're both very easy to work with, and they encourage public-private partnerships. Grant opportunities for a city municipal network that doesn't offer internet services to the citizens are pretty limited. We would say that the best opportunity to examine would be the UASI grant program, and that's the Urban Areas Security Initiative. This results in somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.6 billion a year in grants that serve public safety. The consortium realized about $1.2 million in UASI grants to help them build out the fiber ring around Lake Washington. And what you do is you tie a fiber optic project to the best interests of public safety, law enforcement. So we've had luck in the state with financing fiber optic infrastructure, and I can't think of a better grant opportunity than looking towards a link between Sumner, the C3 ring, and South Sound 911. The State Public Works Board also offers loans to repair public infrastructure in cities. Unfortunately, fiber optics right now in the United States isn't considered infrastructure. Nominally, you could claim that efficiency in delivery of goods and services and transportation would benefit from a loan. I think it's a long shot, but I think over time, working with the Public Works Board in getting them to recognize that fiber optic infrastructure is public infrastructure, you may have luck over time in seeing them as a potential opportunity for funding. I would recommend expanding partnerships between Sumner and your local cities and agencies. Each of the neighbor cities and school districts are willing to collaborate on projects. Public Works and IT should get together on a regular and frequent basis to share ideas and information. C3 offers a regional opportunity to engage and collaborate. Membership is free. C3's vision to expand into Pierce County and Sumner's membership would likely be welcomed. A public partnership could benefit in current franchisees, Wave and Zayo, in expanding their networks and services within the cities. And the case study that we mentioned between Westminster, Maryland, and Ting Networks, that reveals a real economic opportunity for them. In addition to building the city's municipal IT network, the city realizes revenues of $689,000 a year in leasing and subscription revenues. And Ting Networks is the internet service provider, so it's not a city utility. And just a quick mention, also in the report is Morristown, Tennessee. They were an early adopter of fiber optics technology. In 2019, they generated $8.9 million of revenue. So our conclusions very quickly, and I apologize, I'm running right up against 1 hour. Long-term fiber leases can supplement funding for projects. Existing franchises may want to expand within Sumner. We'd recommend that you look at UASI grant opportunities. We think micro trenching is probably the lowest cost alternative. Aerial construction is least expensive, but most vulnerable. Construction on the trail right of way is a low cost alternative. Dig once policies, pay off over time. The return on investment for this project versus commercial carriers is between 25 and 30 years. And really at this point, I say this is the question of do you own versus lease? One thing we do know is that Comcast is not going to hold their rates at their current level for the next 25 to 30 years. Their costs will go up. So really to conclude there, I think staying with the status quo will continue to cost more over time. Next steps, we'd recommend adopting standards and practices, build out a fiber optic master plan, consider dig once policies, look at funding strategies for your 2023 and 2024 budget, and explore collaboration with public and private partnerships. that opens it up for questions
And
and
do we
discussion.
have any more questions for Mr. Dunn? Councilmember Reed.
Thank you. I've got a question, Mr. Dunn, on the public-private partnerships. And are you aware of any type of like voluntary improvement districts where the cost is shared through some major users that would benefit from it?
I will say that the South Bay Council of Cities in the Long Beach area in California has worked with commercial entities in building out their fiber optic network. So those opportunities are there. And I think in summary, you do have good opportunities with Costco, REI, and Amazon in particular.
That's what I was thinking with their heavy technology needs and reliance, that there might be some quite a few public-private partnerships available.
I would agree. And I think the first folks to have a conversation with in that arena would be with Zayo. They have some fairly extensive fiber within Sumner. My guess would be that Amazon, at the very least, is using Zayo services.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Dunn? I think you answered all of them.
Well, I hope so. And I thank you for your time and attention. I am available for questions that you may have after you dive a little bit deeper. But again, Mayor and Council, thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wilson, will this come back to a study session or?
Yeah, Mayor, we'll get this on another study session for some follow-up discussion about next steps. That'll probably be late March or early April.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I think we will move right on into the White River project update. Is that going to be, who is that going to be? Yes.
Mayor, it's a group effort tonight, and I
Okay.
believe that either Mike Dollum or Robbie Wright will start out.
Okay, I see Mr. Dollum has his hand raised, although I don't see him, but there he is. Mr. Dollum? Hello, there he is.
Sorry about that.
If you'd get off the bridge.
So I share.
It's all you.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
So tonight we're giving an update on the White River Restoration Project. The good news is that I'm not giving the whole presentation. It's a joint effort between myself, Robbie Wright, our environmental sustainability specialist, Doug Beagle, our development service director, and Andrea Marquez, our city attorney. Bear with me. This is my first virtual meeting.
Ever?
Yeah. So, we've done a great job of building a manufacturing industrial center in the north end, employing over 16,000 people, delivering goods and services throughout the region. Problem we're having is the rivers filling in with sediment, basically sediment coming down the White River from Mount Rainier. And you can see on this, I'll throw out some numbers, but basically the channel was built to transmit 20,000 CFS cubic feet per second. In 1984, they were down to 16,000 cubic feet per second. And you can see through the years, it's filled in. In 2009 or 2015, we were down to 5,500 cubic feet per second. Well, since then, we put in some HESCO big, huge sandbags, basically, to the south of the 8th Street Bridge. And we're back up to 8,000 cubic feet per second. We might get tested tonight because last time I looked, we're at 7,300 cubic feet per second. So we'll see if we get up to 8,000, if we can still keep it in there. So what we've done is come up with basically 4 projects. And these projects are to widen out the area that the river can flow, but also keep it within that confined area so it doesn't flood the different areas, especially the industrial area. First project is the 8th Street Bridge, Stewart Road Bridge, just off of Stewart Road. And then just down from that, we call the setback levee. So it'll be left bank. And we'll be putting a setback levee back out there so there'll be more room for the river there. The third one is the point bar. So as the river comes around this big bend, it has a tendency to want to go straight into our industrial area. So we'll be putting a setback levee in here, reintroducing this area to the floodplain and be able to keep it in there as it comes around the bend. The fourth project is what we call a habitat project. And that's the project we're going to talk about most today. The habitat project restores about 170 acres back to the floodplains. We'll be creating side channels, wetlands, and large storage areas for the floodwater. So it goes into this habitat project rather than going into the industrial area. And I'll have additional habitat for our endangered species salmon. And with that, I'll turn it over to Robbie.
So Mike touched a bit on some of the purposes for the project, and I kind of wanted to hit on that a little bit more. Mike had mentioned salmon at the end of that, and working with the tribes as a close partner. Salmon are culturally important to them. They're regionally important from an economic standpoint. Fishers are a big economic impact in the area. And from a funding perspective, the PSAR grant that council recently accepted was mainly because we have this benefit of enhancing critical habitat for salmon. The 3 in bold, Chinook, steelhead, and bull trout are all on the endangered species list. And chum, pink, and coho are also frequent in the area. So next slide. A lot of time projects like this in the area can conflict between habitat and protecting jobs, flooding environment, but we do have the big MIC up there. So that's one of the large goals is we're creating this big area for floodwater to go that isn't warehouses or Mankey lumber is shown here. Next slide. So a lot of the businesses in our industrial area are, ones that you all recognize is being things in here. So Costco, wholesale, Penny Salsa, Amazon, a lot of these are, distribution centers. And so protecting our industrial center is one way how we are protecting the supply chains. In a big flood event, places like Costco and Amazon still need to deliver their things. Some of them are, critical goods. Costco delivers, food all over for people. So we're protecting those supply chains. You can go to the next slide. So this will give you a kind of an image of what it's going to look like. So here's before. This is at the tail race looking north towards the golf course with 16th Street in the north end. So this is kind of how it looks today, the before picture. And this is how we expect it to look in the future post-project. So the gray area is where the BNSF tracks will be. And as you can see, we're creating a whole new river channel, which is where that big habitat benefit's going to be coming from for the salmon, a place for them to get out of the main river when flows are getting as high as they are tonight, so they can seek refuge, hide, and eat some food to grow bigger before they migrate downstream out into the Puget Sound. So we have another slide showing the before. So for scale reference, Mike said 170 acres. How big is 170 acres? It's hard to fathom until you see it from an aerial. So that entire side from all the farmland up to the golf course we were looking at earlier is part of this project. This is the largest project of this type in Pierce County, possibly even the state. Next slide. And here's another image of what we expect it to look like in the future. We're moving a lot of dirt, over 1 million cubic yards of it or so, but we'll get more of that later. So next slide. And here's just some stuff of how it will tie in later. So we mentioned partnerships. One of our partners is BNSF. And here's also where their work is tying in with the development, but we'll get into that more in Andrea's portion. So with that, I think we turn it over to Doug to talk about our partnerships some more.
Great, thanks, Robbie. Good evening, Mayor, Council. So when the city first started this, we received legislation funds back in the last quarter of 2015. And at that time, first quarter of 2016, we created what we called a dialogue group. And part of that group was Pierce County, Puyallup Indian tribes, and the Muckleshoot tribes. Well, after 45 meetings with this group, this dialogue group has enlarged to include BNSF, Cascade Water Alliance, and the names of the organizations that you see in black, like for the Plains by Design and Nature Conservancy. They've been either presented this presentation and or been part of the dialogue group or chose to come to a couple of the dialogue group meetings. So with those funds, we were to create a solution for and design one project north of 16th Street. And we had to really look at the whole river from north of our jurisdiction all the way to the confluence. The other thing that has happened within this dialogue group is that they, being all these entities, mainly Pierce County, Puyallup, and Muckleshoot tribes, have been involved in the design. So the permit application that we submitted last year to the Army Corps of Engineers has had all input from these group, and has been a collaborative effort, so that we been very successful in making sure that the Army Corps of Engineers, Fish and Wildlife have been involved, and they know that we've had this collaboration with the tribes. Slide.
So Doug talked about the partnerships with Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. Basically, we're looking at this project and they came in and said, hey, we want to build a siding tracks along this area. And so with those siding tracks, of course, they have to purchase land from the city. So that helps fund the project. And also they have to build up those tracks. So they'll take the excavated material from the project and move it over to the tracks. So they're going to be moving about 1 million cubic yards. If we didn't have them for a partner, it's about $30 a cubic yard to move it and dispose of it. So that's, if I do the math right, $30 million that we're saving by partnering with BNSF. They'll also contour the habitat. So they'll actually remove their material, dig the side channels, and contour the whole area for us before we get in there to plant it. Another advantage we have with the railroad is that they actually have somebody at the Corps of Engineers that does their own plan review for just Burlington Northern or for the railroads. So hopefully that'll help get our core permit through the agency a little quicker. We're also partnering with Cascade Water Alliance. So it's part of the three-party agreement we'll talk about later, but we'll be swapping some land with the railroad and Cascade in order to build this whole project. They authorized their property so that we could put in the permit prior to transferring the ownership of the property. And the other part is allowing us to relocate the tail race. Right now, the tail race just goes straight out to the river here. On the other side of the Burlington Northern tracks, we'll be turning it to the south and moving it down so it meets the river further downstream. That'll help keep backwatering, water from the river going backwards into their turnstocks at where they release the water from the lake taps. Also create nice habitat for salmon in there with the backwater. So our current status, we did put in our core permit in June of 2021. We expect it to take about 12 to 18 months. So we're not looking for our permit till after June of this year. We've done a SEPA on the habitat project. We've completed 90% of plans for this. We've reviewed it. So we're everybody's put their comments in. So we're finalizing those plans as we speak. And then we're completing the utility relocation design and also the permitting to relocate those utilities. And we're hoping to do that this spring, summertime, relocate our utilities and try to get PSE in right behind us to relocate their utilities. So now I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So the project components that everybody just spoke about ultimately have to be wrapped up in written agreements so that all of the parties involved in this huge project understand their roles and responsibilities, the timing, etc. So my goal tonight is to introduce you to the master agreements at a high level, the basic purposes and terms of those agreements so that you have an idea of what to expect in the coming months as we continue to negotiate with all of our partners on the agreements that will ultimately make this project a success. Our goal is to have these agreements negotiated and ready to execute for council approval by the time that a core permit is issued. Next slide. So the first agreement that I want to introduce you to tonight is a purchase and sale agreement between the City of Sumner and BNSF. And this is about that strip of property that Robbie and Mike just spoke about for BNSF's sidetrack project. It's approximately 250 feet, and there's an image on the next slide that we'll get to. There's approximately 250 feet there in the lime green that BNSF needs in order to build out their 10 sidetracks. As part of that purchase and sale agreement, there are terms and provisions that relate to BNSF's excavation of the 1 million cubic yards of soil, and also the logs that BNSF they currently own, that they will be providing to the city in kind for our engineered log jams that will go in these side river channels. So that it's the value of the work that BNSF will be providing to the city is providing the city with fair value for the property that it will convey to BNSF. This is not intended to have cash exchange hands, but rather be a swap of services for property. Next slide. So this is that image that we were just talking about. You saw it earlier in the presentation, but the property in lime green is intended to be conveyed to BNSF in exchange for BNSF excavating out everything that you see in the darker green color here. And we color coded the area of property that was formerly the golf course that will be sold to Principal after it is finished being used as a staging yard for the logs I just referenced and all the equipment necessary for the excavation. Next slide. So the second agreement is called the site work agreement. This agreement is also between the City of Sumner and BNSF. And the site work agreement is really the meat of the deal between us and the railroad. It discusses who is responsible for what and when. So for example, there are provisions about the collaborative effort that we have already undertaken regarding the permit applications to the Army Corps of Engineers. That was a design and application preparation exercise that members of the city and BNSF team shared equally. And it's been years of work in the making before we were even prepared to submit for that Corps permit. It discusses design and construction plan, preparation and approval processes. It discusses the side channel work that BNSF will be undertaking, when they can start, how much work they have to do, the fine grading requirements, rough grading requirements that they will have to comply with for those side channels. There are provisions about the railroad's ability to take that dirt that they excavate out to build up their sidetrack berm, and the price and the value on that dirt. There are provisions for inspection and approval rights throughout the construction project. So the figurative handoff, if you will, after BNSF is complete with the excavation work, when the city steps in and takes over on the river project. There are warranties and representations that both parties will be providing to one another, because this is such a joint undertaking that we have to rely very heavily on each other to make sure that the project is a success. And then of course there's indemnification language that we've been negotiating for several years. These agreements are not new. We've been working on them for quite some time, but we're getting to the point now where it's important to introduce council to them because they will be forthcoming. Next slide. So here's another image that helps set the stage for what the site work agreement addresses. Again, in the lime green, that's the property that the city intends to convey to the railroad and will be the home of the 10 side tracks that BNSF intends to build. Everything else you see here will be excavated out by BNSF. And Mike or Doug, I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but what's the elevation differential between now and after the excavation is complete? A couple of
So
feet.
up by the golf course, it's up to 3 feet a cut. And down at the south end by the GSA building will be roughly 8 feet a cut. And then the one thing that we were able to do is we were able to design this so that we could save that very large maple tree in the middle of the project. It's very important. We've had questions about that from citizens.
Thank you. Next slide. So the third agreement, and perhaps the most important agreement to really make this project a success, is something we have called the three-party agreement. This is an agreement between Cascade Water Alliance, BNSF, and the city. And it involves property conveyances that are required to make this thing work. It involves boundary line adjustments that are required before properties can be conveyed. It involves easements and upwards of 40 sub-agreements that are required to ultimately make this work. So it has been, like I said, years in the making already, and we're working really hard to prepare all of the documents that will be necessary for closing on this project. So most importantly, most importantly from the city's perspective, the three-party agreement addresses the relocation of the tail race. Cascade Water Alliance owns that big body of water that goes east-west from the old powerhouse to the river. And as part of this project, the city will be relocating that to the south. And as you might imagine, that matters a lot to Cascade. They care deeply about the design and the future of their tail race facility. And so there's a lot of detail in this three-party agreement about the city's responsibilities related to the relocated tail race. Of course, we have to also acquire the property that the current tail race is located on. So Mike, do you mind going to the next slide, please? Everything that you see here in yellow is currently owned by Cascade Water Alliance, but will, through this project, be acquired by the city. Everything you see in red here is currently owned, not everything. Numbers 6 and 7 are currently owned by the city of Sumner, and BNSF needs it in order to build their side tracks. And then what you see here in 3 and 5 are currently owned or the responsibility of Cascade Water Alliance, and those will be conveyed to the railroad. Number 5 is the railroad bridge that goes over the tail race. And as part of an old 1911 agreement between Cascade Water Alliance and Burlington Northern, Cascade Water Alliance is actually responsible for maintaining that railroad bridge and replacing it or expanding it if the railroad so desires. So as part of this project, and the reason that it's so important that all 3 parties be involved is because Cascade, as you might imagine, doesn't want to be in the bridge building business. So they, as part of this agreement, will get out from under that obligation and BNSF will take it back over. So if you go back to the last slide, Mike, I just wanted to show that image so that council understands the properties we're talking about here. So as part of the 3-party agreement, there have been countless monthly meetings related to the design of the project and plan approval. Cascade's engineer, the city's engineer, and BNSF's engineers have all been involved in the design and development of the plans that will encompass this project. There's indemnification provisions, there's warranties that all the parties are making related to the success of this project. There's representations on the property conveyances. There's responsibility for ongoing maintenance, both for the railroad's maintenance of the bridge and the city's maintenance of the relocated tail race. So like I said earlier, it really takes all 3 parties to make this work. Each party is gaining something for what they are providing to the collective effort. And so this is a very important agreement. We have been working really hard to negotiate terms that are fair for everybody involved, and will continue to do so. We suspect that the timing on this agreement will be upon receipt of an Army Corps permit, because there may be conditions in that Corps permit that require some last minute tweaks on these agreements, and then they would be before council for approval so that all the property conveyances can close and construction can begin. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have. The whole team is happy to answer any questions that you all may have, but that's a high level introduction to the, oh, it's a walnut tree, not a maple tree. Thank you, Doug. Happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Councilmember Brown.
Yes, I read one thing, but I saw another. Is the railroad is in the east or west side?
You caught my typo, Councilmember Brown. The property that we are conveying to the railroad is to the west of their current.
All right. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any other questions? That's a lot of work. Okay, I see no other questions. I think you did a good job explaining it, I would say. All right. Next steps on this one.
We anticipate being back before council a couple more times before you're ultimately asked to approve the agreements, with periodic updates as we negotiate the terms. And then, like I said, this is largely dependent on when the Corps issues a permit, which will trigger us being able to come and get approval on the final versions of all of these agreements. So sometime in the summer or early fall, we hope we'll be back before you for approval.
Okay, thank you. Nice work. Okay, so I think we'll move on to Parks Master Plan, Siebenthaler and Old Bennett property. And I think we have Mr. Barry on board.
Good evening. Can you guys hear and see me?
Yes.
I thought I'd throw up the Sumner White River Restoration for support for them. Great job, guys. So tonight, Juliet Vong has joined us from HBB. In May of 2021, we started our public outreach for the master planning of Siebenthaler and the Bennett property. Quite a bit of outreach. a lot of good responses from the public. And I shared with you some information, I think it was last month and a half ago, on the preferred concepts, and went through that process with you a little bit, but I'm gonna have Juliet go through our presentation tonight, kind of going over some of the same information, but a little bit more detail. So let me load it up here. Unless Juliet, are you on as a panelist and you can run with it, or do you want me to do it?
I think I am. I can give it a shot, and if something weird happens with my screen, you can be the backup.
Okay.
So my name's Juliet. It is nice to see everybody here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and put this into presentation mode and see how this works out. So can everybody see my screen okay? All right, I'm seeing some head nods. We'll go with this. So most of this you're going to see from the last time. I've just added some of the newer information to help convey the current status of our process from the preferred master plan concepts that you saw Derek present previously to where we're at today. So I'm going to flip through a couple of these items relatively fast. I did see, I think, a hand up before I got started.
Well, that's Councilmember Brown. I think he just didn't put it down.
Okay. And Derek, I will say I have a really hard time presenting and like tracking things. So if somebody does put their hand up or have a question midway, please holler out so that I can
try to
pause
keep an eye
when
out.
needed.
I'll try to watch.
Thank you. All right, so the public process, Derek went over in the past. I've highlighted here down in the bold on the bottom some of the updates to this public process since our last discussion. So Derek did attend a Sumner Rotary meeting. I did forget to bold it, but to discuss some of the concepts. And then we also took the preferred concepts that you saw previously. We put them up on the website through about half of January and had another public survey to get some feedback. We asked people what they were most excited about for each of the preferred concepts, and then had more of an open-ended question if there's anything else they'd like to let us know. You can see what I've pulled off to the side here is what was the top 5 activities or programming elements for each of the parks that the community really wanted to see. We use this as a way of really gauging some of the priorities for some potential first phase of improvements. So for Sabenthaler, it was the spray park by and large got the most interest, and a more permanent dog park. And then beyond that, it was ADA parking, some of the wetland planting concepts, and the play area. For the Bennett property, it was mostly the play area. And then the fitness stations, multi-purpose court, plazas, and walking and walkways, trails were all relatively even. And then the shelter picnic areas was kind of the next. We are currently presenting the final concepts and cost estimates to you tonight. And then after any discussion or questions that you have, we'll proceed with sort of final documentation and come back to more approval at a later date. So existing conditions, just to remind everybody, Sabenthaler Park, the new property that was added outlined in the dashed orange with wetlands in this sort of dotted line. The previous preferred concepts that we showed you had a play area and a spray park as kind of upgrading, expanding, and becoming the core of the improvements with more plaza, covered picnic, and open space areas. With the spray park, we do need a restroom. And then that necessitated some shifting of the sport court. We moved the dog park off to what would be the east end of the park so that we could make it a little bit larger, and then kind of looped everything with some more trails through the park. The final master plan that we're proposing remains much the same. We received some comments both during the process and meetings that Derek had, as well as with the Parks, Forestry and Parks Commission. So some of the things were to look at this overlook and make sure it was accessible. So we made this more of a paved trail and overlook area. There was some interest in really bringing in more trees. I think one of the nicest elements of this is the shade that happens on this north end. And so bringing some more trees and shade canopy into the rest of the park. And then looking at ways to kind of further separate a little bit more the playground from what could be the right of way in this area through here. We also looked at kind of how to tie the remaining lawn together a little bit better. And then I didn't mention this before, but as a reminder, we do have ADA parking proposed long-term in the master plan. Short-term, we would look at restriping a parallel ADA stall. And then this design is also developed so that you could in the future convert all of the on-street parking through this, this area to a back-end parking if additional parking were needed once the spray park is the likely scenario between the spray park and the play area. If it gets as heavy use as we might expect it to, and the neighbors really do find a need for additional parking, we've kind of accounted for that in the long-term master plan. The cost estimates are something that I'm sure is curious and comes up often. What I'm showing here is a series of the major divisions of park improvements. This is for the entire master plan. So as if you were to do everything kind of all at once. And I've broken out the site improvements into some smaller elements so that you can really start to see where the dollars total comes from and how it all adds up. So you can see the bulk of the improvements really comes from those site improvements. That's everything from the benches and picnic tables to the restroom, permanent restroom facilities, shade structures, the dog park, and all of the lighting and kind of supporting infrastructure that goes into those features. Sort of the earthwork and site preparation utility work forms a fair amount, as does the paving. In particular, because of the paving, it does include the potential for all of that right-of-way work. So this is intended to be kind of a very conservative estimate. It is intended for that budgeting purposes and would be kind of the most you would expect to spend on improving the park. There are lots of opportunities to design to a lesser budget, to break things into smaller pieces, to build a master plan over time. But these initial estimates are sort of all inclusive. So with that, you end up with a total construction cost of about 4.8 million. When you add mobilization, sales tax, you can see it adds fairly quickly up to a little over 5 million. We also want to show long-term the soft costs associated with these improvements. And so that includes design fees, permitting fees, of course, contingencies, and you can see how all of those costs do compound to a pretty high, kind of sometimes overwhelming number. The idea here, though, is that you're not going to build this all in one stage. So we sort of break things into smaller pieces and work towards grant funding and other funding opportunities to build this over time. I'm going to go ahead and go through the Bennett property as well, and then we can come back.
Could I ask the question?
Yes, or we can do questions now. That works too.
What do you mean by mobilization?
So contractor mobilization. So when contractor bids a project, he has the physical cost of doing the improvements, purchasing the equipment, the labor to actually install, play equipment and paving and other materials and resources. Mobilization is a percentage that is applied on top of that. It often includes some of the contractor's overhead costs. It includes the equipment rentals and other sorts of costs that aren't directly related to the materials and labor.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question.
Councilmember Cole.
Yes, just one quick question. Over how many years would this be for this particular park?
Master plans are often developed on about a 20-year vision. How quickly something can get constructed depends extensively on the funding that might be available, the ability to get grants or other funding opportunities that might come into play. Not knowing exactly how this might get funded, most of the time these are at least a good 10-year plans. And then if funding is difficult or challenging, it can take even longer.
Great, thank you.
I will also say there are some parts of this that you may never need to completely fund, like that street frontage improvements. That is a complicated process to change the street frontage and change curbs and drainage and paving. And it may happen that you never need all of it or that you may never need any of it. So some of these costs can certainly have a variety of savings. There's also some cost opportunities to combining things together. So if you're just building a spray park, you can see with $1 million kind of budget associated with that, you have things like the mechanical equipment, the plumbing equipment, the housing that has to go into, plus the spray features and the paving. If you build it at the same time with shade structures or other components, you can get some cost savings by combining certain elements. So as projects get developed and matched to grant and other funding opportunities, you can kind of develop various phases and packages to best suit whatever the opportunities for funding might be.
Okay, thanks.
Excuse me. Any other questions about Sabenthaler before I move on to Bennett?
Nope.
Okay.
Oh, we do. Councilmember Stewart.
Thank you. I was a little slow on raising my hand. This is a really good cost estimate spreadsheet. Is there a way you can send that to the council?
Derek, I'm assuming that
Yeah.
will come from you and all this detail is available. Derek, I don't know if I sent you the PDF directly, but I will do that right after this meeting.
Yeah, we'll get it to you.
All right, thank you. And then this question may apply to both parks, and maybe I should wait till later, but I'm curious about security.
It is a good question. We did look at it for both parks. I can highlight here, it may be difficult to see at the scale, but for Sabenthaler, we are looking at lighting along both the street frontage and around the play area and Spray Park, recognizing that this is a location that might want to get used a little bit beyond when it can get dark in here during some of our seasons. So that does have some additional lighting. Both sites also include a pedestrian emergency telephone connection so that there is an emergency resource for anybody who might need it out at the park. We looked at crime prevention through environmental design techniques, that's CPTED for short. Those are basically, it's a whole kind of discipline that we have some experts in-house, as well as Derek's got some experience with this as well. It's a method of really looking and evaluating a site to think about more intuitive ways to make things feel safer and more comfortable, things like sight lines, activating parks, eyes on the park, things like that. So keeping views open, having lighting in appropriate places where needed, thinking about how it's going to be used and how the visibility through the park can continue to be used over time.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor, and Earl beat me to it. I was going to wait until after the Bennett one, but there's I have the same concern on security. I think this is something that we're going to want to address in the long-term budgeting, either in some type of increased presence and enforcement, or anticipating heavy replacement costs based on what we've already been seeing from the other parks. We're going to have to mitigate that in some way. And what that looks like, I don't know, but it's not evident in the initial cost estimates. So that's something we would probably want to work in there at some point. But otherwise, I love it.
Thank you. I think that does bring up something I didn't mention. Derek is, in particular, has been doing some research, and we're doing some to support as well. O&M costs, and in particular O&M costs associated with the Spray Park, is something that we are evaluating further as well. Maintenance, replacement, vandalism, those things happen, obviously, as you're aware, in just about any park situation. Some of the materials we can use can help reduce that and make it easier to maintain. Others of those materials really need careful consideration before they put in place. Spray parks in particular do have a tendency for vandalism. There's some really brightly colored, fun sort of equipment pieces that move that tend to be prone to vandalism, as we're finding out through our research. So final design of those elements really becomes important as you think about how you're going to maintain them and continue to keep them maintained to the high level that you do for a lot of your parks. And that's a big element in reducing some of the vandalism and potential crime as well. Anything else on Sabenthaler?
No, go ahead.
All righty. Bennett property, this one got awfully fuzzy. I apologize. We probably copied and pasted this a few too many times. Hopefully you all can remember where this is at in the world. And I think as you talk about security, that is certainly a concern that we've discussed at length on this particular property. We are surrounded by single family residences with currently a single entrance off of the highway here. We have a single wetland that kind of sits in the middle of the property. The preferred concept that you saw previously, a major component was providing access to this park and for both security as well as emergency vehicle reasons, amongst others, protecting the neighborhood being one of them, bringing the circulation through the park, off to 46 to provide more than one way in and out of the site was an important component. You can see the uses that were proposed remain very much in place. And a big component of this, including for the cost, is the fact that the wetland sits in the heart of the park. So one of the major elements of this is actually doing the wetland mitigation to relocate, improve, and create a much stronger wetland system that helps act as a buffer and a little bit of a security to those adjacent residences. Our final master plan looks much the same. I'm actually going to flip back and forth a couple of times because it's a little hard to see where the changes were. This one was really heavily supported by the process. The biggest elements we kind of looked at was there was some comments to get some stronger buffering along the backside of these neighbors. They were feeling a little bit left out of the buffer components. And so we did add some buffering there as well as in the front here. This is a tricky relationship between making sure views of Mount Rainier remain while still providing some canopy and some trees and some accent planting within the heart of the park. So again, as final design occurs, we'll need to continue to pursue that and look at that a little bit closer. Also bringing in more canopy was a comment from the Forestry and Parks Commission, particularly around the open space. They really liked the trail system. There's some discussion about this sort of entry plaza. Right now, we're preserving a decent amount of space for some sort of a public art. The idea here is that we wanted it to be somewhat iconic, somewhat, grand gesture to really give this park its own character and sense. The commission really liked the idea of highlighting ecology, highlighting something natural, highlighting something with the wetland system that gets created, really making this feel very site specific. And so there's a lot of space kind of to that end. However, we could easily also see a lot of this planting coming in if not as much space was necessarily needed. And that's kind of the only other element we really have here between these two. The cost estimates for the Bennett property come in. Of course, this is a larger site. We have a significant amount of wetland restoration that needs to happen. So the planting and irrigation cost is a bit higher. And again, the bulk of those costs are in the site improvements. You can start to see the breakdown here. The playground is a very large playground, so a little bit more budget given over to that. Restrooms and structures kind of equal out a lot of those components. Higher cost utilities and drainage work, the paving work, because it is an undeveloped site and it does have a new, more extensive parking proposed. So when those construction costs of about 5 million for a new park add up to a little over 6 million, when you add in the mobilization and sales tax, that would be your construction budget. You add in the soft cost of design, permitting, contingencies, all the unavoidable things that we don't have a way to account for, and your budget is closer to about 9.5 million. This one is a little bit harder to slice and dice into too many smaller pieces. Really, we needed to think about what is a minimum improvement to open this up to the public. We need to be able to bring access. We need to have ADA accessible parking at the site. We need some kind of a trail system and likely some kind of a restroom facility as well in order to just open up the park. Once we kind of get more into phasing and funding opportunities, we can start to develop what that could look like a little bit more. Any questions on this one?
Any questions for this one? Mr. Wilson, will we have any time on our council retreat to discuss any of this, like maybe the funding or?
So not specifically the funding piece of this. What you can discuss at the council retreat is this a priority, right? Because we're looking at strategic priorities and how does this rank on the multitude of things that council wants to achieve. And then from there, and then Derek might touch on this as he closes it up, but I think staff needs to go back and figure out what are your options, because you do have options on how to fund these. And as Juliet just mentioned, there's phases and then different funding mechanisms.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart.
Thank you. That was my question was, have you considered what funding sources might be available for this? And I realize that we're looking at a long-term project here, but I'm assuming that there will be some grant applications. And so can you hum a few bars about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. The RCO grant funding cycle is in full swing. Now the grant applications just opened and Derek has been in communications with the RCO grant managers to try to understand really what would be the right and most competitive collection of improvements for each of these parks to try and receive some grant funding. So hence that's kind of where that development of what is the minimum we might need to open the Bennett property particularly, and try and get RCO funding to support that. So RCO is not likely to fund a project that doesn't include ADA parking or restrooms for a park of this size, for example. Doesn't necessarily always have to be permanent restrooms, but we need to account for them in some way. It's difficult, for RCO to fund something that doesn't have some recreational improvement. So at least a trail that gives people a walking experience and a recreational experience at a park. So those kinds of conversations are currently underway with RCO to try and see if we can't put a grant application together either in this round or something that's coming up shortly after. Derek, does that cover it pretty well for some of the initial discussions?
Yeah, that was a good summary of it. I've met with our grant manager, some pretty good conversations about this, Bennett in particular, because it's a brand new park. It puts us into a different category because we're going to look at acquiring that property to the north to finish out the access onto 46th. So that's a good thing for us. The bad part is, of course, it's going to cost us more with the match portion of it, but it does help us out. There's some strategies behind it. There are some other options that she went over with me with other categories within RCO. So we're going to have ongoing conversations with her on, like Juliet summarized, what is the minimum to get this going? What's the best strategy? What do you think is going to give us a successful application? They have some incredibly challenging and competitive grants, and they have some others that quite often have been pretty open and available. But
There's some underutilized grants that would be great to try and have the right project to fit into.
Yep. So we're looking at, is there a combination of it as well? So our grant manager's been fantastic and very helpful with it, but it's not the only funding source. We'll be trying to get as creative as possible. I try to do that with everything. So definitely limited with high dollar figures here.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I can just add, we are, other funding sources include park impact fees, general fund dollars, and potentially some sort of parks levy, like an excess levy that you may want to consider. These are just two of the multiple parks projects that are being worked on right now. So I think it will require a much broader discussion with council on, what you want to accomplish and how soon you want to accomplish it.
Thank you. All right.
All right. The last slide I had was just looking at what our next steps are. If there is general consensus in the direction that we're currently showing with the master plans from today's discussion, we're not asking for formal approval, but we are looking to make sure that we are in line with what your visions or expectations are. We would then move forward with the master plan report documentation, pulling together the actual final report, finalizing what that initial phase is likely to be and what some of our goals are. As we develop the master plan report, the phasing and the grant opportunities are we typically similar to your planning documents for the city. We leave them a little bit more open-ended, so there's flexibility in what you actually build with a first phase that matches your best opportunity to get some of those grants. But we will start to highlight what some of those opportunities might be. We also get started on the SEPA checklist and then ultimately look for long-term the council adoption once that documentation is complete.
All right. Sounds like a lot of work to me.
And up next, we're gonna be doing. You'll be seeing this again in early April for adoption of the plan. At that time, you'll probably be seeing something called a grant authorization as well. It's RCO requirement for any application you do. It's pretty standard. We've done it for every application we've done with RCO. So you'll see a slew of those saying, yes, you have authorization to apply for this through RCO. So you'll see a little bit more next month.
And anybody can come and talk to Derek if they have questions or would like to talk about the parks.
We can even go on a site tour.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you,
Mayor,
Julia.
if I could just add in, I know Councilmember Reed has a question, but
Oh,
if council has any objections to what they're seeing, we really need to hear that by the end of this week. Because, you know, Derek and Juliet need the time to adequately put this together for the April 4th meeting for your consideration. And we're not asking you to fund it, but just on the overall concept of what is included in both of these properties, that's what we're really looking for immediate feedback on.
well, I do have some questions, but I do have a question for myself for Mr. Berry. Have you considered putting the spray park in a different park that's not so, that's more in the central, like Rainier View? There's citizens around. I'm talking about for vandalism, just to keep an eye on it. Siebenthaler seems a little out of the way. Just curious of why you picked Siebenthaler.
So in 2016 through 2018, when we did our Parks and Trail Master Plan update, spray parks is one of the most requested things we've had. At that time, gauging the council, I don't think anyone was ready to do a spray park. Even to this day right now, it's a big improvement. So at that time, I was told to go ahead and try to get the Rainier View covered court. So we pushed forward with that. As you know, we've got funding for that moving forward. If you look at the plan for Rainier View Park in particular, it does show a potential spray park. It could be we'd call them a splash pad, where the features are a little different. Maybe it's not a full blown spray park. I would say with Rainier View, with that covered court and the new playground it's going to be needing to get here in the next 2 to 3 years for the replacement, and a spray park, you're looking at possibly overwhelming that park, depending on the scale that you do a spray park there. Siebenthaler, it's got quite a bit of on-street parking, and that's where we have the option for the back-end angled later if we want. Septed Principal, it's still kind of in the open there behind the court and off of Bonnie Avenue. But no, there's no real saying yes or no to any park, really. It comes down to, is there a real push for Rainier View to get one? Does Loyalty really need one? Do we need to have one at the sports complex? I mean, it's kind of one of those, let's work with the community. What are the plans or what are the wants, and let's try to accomplish it. So I'm not against it. I just think we need to be careful with how we design it and what it looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to add one more thing onto that really quickly, just because one of the strongest components of Septed is like, I think you mentioned, like eyes on the park, having people nearby. During the public process, we had a couple of residents, one who lived really close to the park, who was very, very vocal and very, very strong about his desire to continue to see improvements in Siebenthaler, and just how much he's there, hearing it, seeing it, being able to recognize it. In particular, I guess I wanted to mention it because the dog park is one of the biggest activators. Day, night, weekend, rain, shine, you get so much of those eyes on the park. And so the combination of the dog park having that activity on a more regular basis with having that spray park gives, I think, a little bit better Septed and eyes on the park. Even though it feels a little bit more removed, the activities are going to generate more direct interest during the hours that are closer to when you might want some extra eyes on the park. So that was another thing that Derek and I did kind of talk a little bit about when we were looking at, does Siebenthaler make sense to put in a spray park?
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Reed.
Thank you, Mayor. So if I understood correctly, you're looking for a general direction, not necessarily direction or decision, but just kind of an overall feeling. I love the plans. I love that there's a lot of flexibility to them, especially when it comes to grant processes. I'm not a fan of levies and tax increases. I'm not favorable in that direction, but I am very interested in grants and the matching opportunities to go with the grants. So overall, love it. And I'd like to just add that my wife would really love to see a dog park at either Rainier or Loyalty.
Councilmember Botetto.
Yeah, I must not have been paying good attention, but Juliet, where do you don't work for the city, correct?
You caught
And you-
me. I totally forgot my introduction when I
Yeah.
started.
So I just kind of, it'd be nice to know where you work.
I apologize. I just was so excited. I jumped right in. So yeah, I am vice president of a firm called HBB Landscape Architecture. We are based out of Seattle. We do almost all of our work in the Puget Sound region. And I actually had the benefit and the privilege of working on the previous PROS plan as well prior to this. So I'm quite familiar with the city and its overall park system.
Well, I appreciate
Thank
your
you for asking.
presentation. Just, I know we haven't seen you before, or I haven't, so, but anyway, no, it was a good job, and I just appreciate the thoroughness, and then walking us through it. So, and I'm in favor of moving forward.
Deputy Mayor Hochstetter.
Thank you. This question is for Juliet. What do you envision these wetland buffers to end up looking like?
We have a fair amount of control into kind of how we design and develop those, but they are natural spaces. They are a little bit wild in their appearance and their aesthetic. They need to perform a certain environmental function in order to meet the criteria of a wetland restoration and mitigation project. They are typically a mix of shrubs and ground covers. There are, obviously a lot more dogwoods and things that really like wet climates, some willows and other types of vegetation. They can be a little bit more dense. And so I think one of the concerns and one of the discussions we've had is just how dense do they need to be to meet the function, and how much can we keep some views and corridors open? At Sabenthaler, it's tucked in the back, and we actually want it to be probably a little bit denser. The wetness makes it very undesirable for a lot of maybe less desirable long-term occupation and constituents in those areas. But at Bennett property, I think the design is going to want to really pay special attention to making sure people can't go back in there, hide back in there. We want it to serve as a buffer, but it's got to be somewhat visible so you can still maintain and have that crime prevention opportunity to it. That's kind of a very broad answer, but hopefully that gives you an idea.
But what I'm wondering about is like on the Bennett property, is it supposed to be something you kind of view from that walkway that goes through it?
Yeah, the walkway is intended to kind of be that shortcut to the neighborhood and allow kids to come through. On either side of that walkway, we would keep it very open for those view corridors. We don't have to have dense vegetation everywhere. So it actually make a really nice view of the wetland environment. The density I'm worried about is more like the edges.
Okay, and then the other one, is this a walking path that goes through it so you view vegetation?
Yep.
Okay, so it can be smaller and interesting vegetation.
Oh, definitely.
I'm just hoping it's not just going to look like these dead log things that they do. I know they're doing those for fish a lot of time, but still you end up sometimes where it just looks like it's so fakely constructed that it's not a real, to me, and not a real in nature area. And I just was wondering if you're envisioning that being a more real natural nature area to walk in.
My hope is that it feels very natural, but along the trails, it needs to stay a little bit more open. So we've had some success of kind of keeping the vegetation a little bit more maintainable, I guess I would say, along the edges of the trail, and letting that wildness sort of happen more towards the backsides. That would be my hope. That allows the best opportunity for education and to have kids come through and learn about what it is and why it's even there, while still, again, we're always trying to kind of keep an eye on how to maintain it, how to keep visibility through it in the long term. It's a delicate balance, and it definitely takes some maintenance, which is one of the reasons we started thinking about how much maintenance needs to happen to these parks for the various improvements.
But is that also one of the first things that goes in to start shaping the park?
For the Bennett property, it will need to be, because the existing wetland, really, there's almost no way to develop this without impacting that wetland in some form or fashion. So a portion of that wetland restoration would have to likely go in with the initial phase. For Sabenthaler, not so much, because it is tucked onto that newer property and more removed. We don't need to necessarily impact it initially. So we have a little bit more flexibility there.
Okay, great. Well, I'll just say that I am in favor of both of the plans and they look very nice. And I'm hoping that we can do them in shorter times than 10 years or 20 years. So thank you very much for your work.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Derek or Juliet?
See Patrick's, Councilmember Reed's question about the goats and sheep. I'm not sure, Patrick. I'm not gonna say yes or no for sure on that one. I'm kind of hoping not.
All right, thank you.
Only if he's the shepherd.
Shepherd's Park.
Yeah. Derek, thanks for all your hard work on this.
Thank you. It's been
A lot
fun to
of-
work
lot
on.
of work. Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll move on to the city administrator report.
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple things tonight. Just a reminder, we have our council retreat this Saturday from 9 until 3. It is here at City Hall. Earlier tonight, I emailed all of you a couple documents to help prepare for our retreat. And then if you want a paper copy of those, please let me know and I will put them in your box downstairs. Couple other things. Next week, we do have a special study session, and this is right after our regular council meeting. We have a very light regular council meeting agenda, but we are going to have a special study session to follow up on our senior housing amendments, as well as the potential to expand the MFTE. As Mike mentioned earlier, the rivers are rising. They do appear to be hopefully staying within the river boundaries, but we will see some localized flooding along our trail system, possibly around our treatment plant, and maybe in the River Grove neighborhoods. But we typically see when the Puyallup reaches around 25 feet. That happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Jason? Seeing none, do we have any council meeting changes, committee changes? Cindy?
Yes, I am not going to be able to come to the council study session on March 14th.
Okay. Anybody else have any? Patrick?
One is a little ways out, the week of May 14th. I won't be able to attend the council meeting or the committee meetings that week. And then, so everybody's aware, on the retreat for Saturday, our daughter has a band presentation that morning at 9 o'clock. So I'm not going to be able to be there until about 10:30, depending on how long that lasts.
We'll save all the hard stuff until you get there.
Not a problem. I'll probably create some of my own too.
Okay.
Mr. Reed, if I could just clarify, May 14th is a Saturday. Are you going to be gone the week before or the week after?
I'm sorry, the week after, that
Week after.
whole following week. Yeah, I don't return until that Friday.
Thank you.
Okay. Council meeting agenda. Do we have anything on the calendar that we need to talk about, Jason?
No, ma'am.
And we have no executive session, so I say we adjourn.